My husband secretly transferred our home into his name and sold it for $1.5 million. The new owners were already standing at the door with the keys. I smiled, let them in, and immediately called my lawyer. What happened next? Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. The house on Clover Hill Road had been mine long before it was ours. I want you to understand that from the very beginning, because it matters. It matters more than I realized for most of my marriage. My father built that house in 1961, poured the foundation with his own hands on a Saturday in October, and I grew up watching the oak tree in the backyard grow from a sapling into something you could lean against and feel the whole weight of the world ease off your shoulders. When my parents passed, they left the house to me. Not to us. To me, Margaret Ann Arlo, née Whitfield. I was 51 years old, and I thought that detail, my name on the deed, was just a formality, the kind of paperwork nobody thinks about until they have to. Dennis and I had been married for 31 years by then. We weren't a romantic story, not the kind you'd tell at a dinner party. We were practical, steady. He sold commercial insurance. I had retired from teaching 4th grade, and we spent our evenings watching the news and arguing pleasantly about whether the tomatoes needed more water. I cooked Sunday roasts. He fixed the gutters in the fall. We were, as far as I understood the word, fine. The first sign came in March, about 14 months before everything fell apart. Dennis started taking phone calls in the garage. Now, I am not a paranoid woman. I have never gone through a man's pockets or checked his phone. That has never been my nature. But Dennis had always been a loud talker. You could hear him from 2 rooms away, the kind of voice that filled a space whether you wanted it to or not. And suddenly, he was taking his coffee out to the garage and closing the door. And when he came back in, his expression had that careful blankness that I recognized from 30 years of marriage as the face he wore when he didn't want me to ask questions. I didn't ask, not then. In April, he suggested we take a trip to Florida. Dennis hated Florida. He had always called it God's waiting room, with the particular contempt of a man who refused to acknowledge that he was 66 years old. But there he was, cheerful in a way that felt rehearsed, spreading a travel brochure across the kitchen table and suggesting Clearwater Beach. I went along with it. We spent a week in a rental condo, and he was distant and pleasant, like a man performing the role of husband for an audience I couldn't see. When we came home, I noticed a file folder on his desk that he moved quickly when I walked into the study. That was when the cold feeling started. Not panic, not accusation, just a low, steady chill. The way a house feels when a window has been left open somewhere, and you can't find which one. By June, I had started paying closer attention. I noticed he'd asked me, twice, in casual conversation, whether I still had the original deed documents from when my parents' estate was settled. I told him I kept everything in the fireproof box in the bedroom closet. He nodded and didn't bring it up again. I didn't think much of it at the time. Later, I would understand exactly why he was asking. I also noticed he had started spending time with a woman from his office, Kristen Daly. I had met her once at a company Christmas party. Mid-40s, careful smile, the kind of woman who always seems to be evaluating the room. He mentioned her name a few times in passing, said she was handling a big account with him. I filed that information in the back of my mind the way you file things you're not ready to look at directly. The summer passed. The oak tree in the backyard turned gold. I made apple butter and called my daughter Claire in Portland every Sunday and told her everything was fine because I believed it mostly was. And because what would I even say? And then came that Tuesday in September. I had been at my book club, Doris Hartley's house on Maple Street. We were reading Olive Kitteridge for the second time and arguing about whether Olive was sympathetic. And I came home at 3:30 to find an unfamiliar silver SUV parked in my driveway. A couple stood on my porch, late 30s, well-dressed, the woman holding a set of keys on a plain metal ring. The man had a folder tucked under his arm. They looked at me with an expression I did not immediately understand, a mixture of recognition and discomfort. "Mrs. Harlow?" the woman said. "We were told the house would be vacant." I looked at the keys in her hand. I looked at the folder under his arm. And somewhere in the center of my chest, something that had been quietly tightening for months finally pulled completely taut. I smiled. I cannot fully explain why I smiled. Instinct, perhaps, or the 40 years of practice that comes from managing a classroom full of 9-year-olds who are all lying to you simultaneously. I smiled and I said, "Oh, of course, please come in." And I stepped aside and held the door open. And the moment they walked past me into my living room, I reached into my purse and called Franklin Greer. Franklin was my attorney. He had handled my parents' estate. He had known me for 22 years. He picked up on the second ring. "Franklin," I said quietly, stepping into the kitchen while the couple stood uncertainly in my hallway. "I need you to tell me right now whether anyone has legally transferred the deed to my house." There was a silence on the line that told me everything before he said a single word. Franklin's pause lasted exactly 4 seconds. I counted them. "Margaret," he said, and he never called me Margaret unless something was serious. "I need you to stay calm and not say anything definitive to whoever is in that house with you right now." So it was true. I had known it the moment I saw those keys, but knowing something and having an attorney confirm it are two entirely different experiences. Knowing is a feeling. Confirmation is the floor dropping out from under you. "I understand," I said, in the same even voice I had once used to tell a classroom of children that yes, there was a fire drill, and no, they did not need to panic. I walked back into the hallway. The couple, they told me later their names were Ryan and Melissa Cook, and I want to be clear that they were not villains in this story. They were buyers who had been deceived just as I had. Were standing near the staircase, visibly uncomfortable. The woman still had those keys in her hand, a house key, my house key, cut from a copy that someone had made without my knowledge. "I'm so sorry," I said pleasantly. "There seems to have been a miscommunication about the timeline. Could I ask you to give me 24 hours? I just need to confirm a few details with my husband." I kept the smile absolutely steady. "I'm sure we can get this sorted out." They exchanged a glance. The husband, Ryan, started to say something about a closing date and a moving truck already booked, and I listened to all of it with great attention and nodded in exactly the right places. And then I walked them back to the door and watched their silver SUV back out of my driveway. Then I sat down at my kitchen table and I let myself have 10 minutes. I want to be honest with you about those 10 minutes, because I think people sometimes expect the wronged party in a story like this to be immediately fierce, immediately strategic. I was not. I sat in the kitchen of the house my father had built, at the table where I had fed my children breakfast for 20 years, and I was afraid. Genuinely, physically afraid. The kind of fear that sits in your stomach and makes you feel like you're 80 years old and very small. 31 years of marriage. 31 years of someone's name next to yours on Christmas cards and joint tax returns and the shared shorthand of a life built together. And it had been used against me like a tool. I let myself have those 10 minutes. Then I stood up and washed my face at the kitchen sink. Here is what I knew, sitting at that table before I made another call. Dennis had somehow transferred the deed to my house, inherited from my parents, with my name on the original title, into his name alone, and had then sold it to the Cook family for a sum I would later learn was $1.5 million. He had arranged a closing. He had handed over keys. He had done all of this while I attended book club and made apple butter and called our daughter every Sunday. The questions came fast and cold. Had he forged my signature? Had he found a way through the estate documents? Where was the money? Was it already gone? Was Kristen Daly involved? And underneath all of those questions, the one I kept flinching from, how long had he been planning this? I called Franklin back. The next 40 minutes were the most clarifying of my adult life. Franklin spoke carefully and precisely, the way he always does, and what he told me was this. A deed transfer had been recorded at the county recorder's office 11 weeks earlier. The signature on the transfer document carried my name. I had not signed any such document, which meant one of two things. Either the signature was forged, or I had been manipulated into signing something I didn't understand, possibly buried in a stack of other paperwork. Franklin said the second scenario was more common than most people believed. "What are my options?" I asked. "Your options are significant," he said, "but you need to act carefully and you need to act soon." We agreed to meet the following morning at 9. Before we hung up, Franklin told me one more thing. Under Oregon law, we were in Clover Hill, a suburb of Portland. A marital home required both spouses' consent for sale, regardless of how title was held, if it qualified as the primary residence. There were grounds, potentially strong grounds, to challenge the transfer as fraudulent and to seek an injunction against the sale proceeding. "He may not know that you know yet," Franklin said. "He doesn't," I said. "Then don't tell him tonight." Dennis came home at 6:15, the same time he had come home for 30 years. He smelled like the same aftershave. He asked what was for dinner. He hung his keys on the hook by the door. Not my house keys, I noticed, his car keys. And I made spaghetti. And we sat across from each other at the same kitchen table where I had spent 10 minutes being afraid, and I listened to him talk about a golf game he was planning with someone from the office, and I said, and that sounds nice, and I did not say a single true thing for the entire meal. Watching him that night, the ease of him, the comfort, I felt the fear convert into something else, something quieter and colder and considerably more useful. I had been a teacher for 37 years. I knew how to be patient. I knew how to watch a situation develop and choose exactly the right moment to act. And I knew, with a clarity that surprised me with its force, that I was not going to let Dennis Harlow take my father's house. Before I went to sleep that night, I wrote 3 things in the small notebook I kept in my nightstand: the money, the signature, the woman. Those were the 3 threads I needed to pull. I also wrote a 4th line, which I underlined twice. Do not let him know you know. That was my plan in its earliest form. Crude, yes. But sometimes the most important strategic decision you make is simply to keep your face completely still. I was in Franklin's office at 8:55 the next morning. His office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown, the kind of place with dark wood paneling and the particular smell of old case files. And I had been there enough times over the years that his receptionist, a young woman named Becca, just waved me through without buzzing. I sat across from Franklin's desk in the same chair I'd sat in when we'd settled my mother's estate, and I put the fireproof box on the desk between us. I had retrieved it from the bedroom closet at 5:30 that morning while Dennis slept. I had been very quiet. Inside the box were the original property deed from 1961 in my father's name. The probate documents from when the house transferred to me after my parents passed. My own name on every line, and every property tax notice we had received for the subsequent 17 years, all addressed to Margaret A. Harlow. I also brought every piece of paper I could find that bore my signature. Bank documents, insurance forms, a letter to our homeowners association from 2 years ago. Franklin spread them across his desk and studied them for a long time without speaking. "I'm going to refer you to someone," he said, "a forensic document examiner. Her name is Dr. Patricia Voss. She works out of a firm in Beaverton, and she has testified as an expert witness in 17 fraud cases in this state. I want her to look at the signature on the transfer deed." "How quickly can she do it?" "For something like this, I'll call her this morning. Probably 3 to 4 days for a preliminary assessment." 3 to 4 days. I thought about the Cook family and their moving truck. "What about the sale?" I asked. "If they have a closing date, I filed for a temporary restraining order this morning at 7 a.m., Franklin said. "The transfer of title is frozen pending investigation. The Cook family's attorney has already been notified." I sat very still for a moment. "You filed before I even arrived." "I filed the moment you called me yesterday," he said. He said it simply, without drama, and I was grateful for that. "Margaret, what he did, if the signature is forged, and I believe it is not just a civil matter. This is deed fraud. It's a felony in this state. I had known that was coming. I had known it intellectually since the night before. But hearing it said plainly in a wood-paneled office at 9 in the morning, with my father's 1961 deed lying on the desk between us, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. I drove home along the river. The water was gray-green and very still. I kept both hands on the wheel. Dennis was still home when I got back. He usually left for the office by 9, but his car was still in the driveway, which was unusual enough to make my pulse quicken slightly. I found him in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a cup of coffee, and there was something off about his posture. A kind of alertness that wasn't his normal morning looseness. "Where were you?" he asked. Casual, but his eyes weren't casual. "Grocery run," I said, and held up the small bag I'd had the presence of mind to stop for on the way home. Milk, bread, a box of chamomile tea. We were out of milk. He looked at the bag. He looked at me. I have no idea whether he noticed the fireproof box was gone from the closet. He would have had to look specifically for it to know, and I had replaced it with a similarly sized box of old tax returns. But something was operating behind his eyes that morning that told me the comfortable weeks of his unawareness were ending. I made breakfast. I did not shake. 4 days later, Dr. Patricia Voss sent her preliminary report to Franklin. I read it sitting in Franklin's office again, this time with a cup of tea that had gone cold in my hands. The report was 19 pages. The summary was 3 paragraphs. The most important sentence was in the second paragraph, and I read it twice. The questioned signature on Document A, Warranty Deed Transfer, Recorded Date, exhibits significant variation from the known exemplars in letter formation, pen pressure, and baseline alignment, inconsistent with normal variation, and is consistent with simulation by a person other than the purported signer. Forged. My signature had been forged on a legal document to steal my house. I put the paper down on Franklin's desk and looked out his window at the traffic below, and thought about the woman named Kristen Daly, and whether she had known, and how long it had been planned, and at what specific point in our 31-year marriage my husband had looked at me and decided I was an obstacle rather than a person. "There's something else," Franklin said. He turned his computer screen toward me. He had pulled the county property records, following the money the way you follow a river to its source. The sale price was listed, $1,500,000. The wire transfer had gone to a joint account, not our joint account, a new one, opened 6 months ago at a bank I'd never heard of, in the names of Dennis R. Harlow and Kristen Ann Daly. There it was, all 3 threads in one document. I thought about the 10 minutes I had spent being afraid at my kitchen table. I thought about my father driving fence posts into the earth on a cold October morning in 1961. I thought about every Sunday I had spent making the roast and not asking questions. "What do we do next?" I asked. Franklin had already printed the filing forms. This was the point, I realized. Sitting in that chair, with forged paper and a fraudulent bank account on the desk in front of me, from which there was no returning to anything that had been before. Not to the spaghetti dinners. Not to the comfortable silences. Not to the version of my life in which I had been the woman who did not ask questions. I picked up a pen, and I started signing my actual, real, unforged name. The restraining order hit Dennis like a cold bucket of water, and I know this because I was home when he got the call. It was a Thursday afternoon, 4 days after my second meeting with Franklin. I was in the garden. I had been spending more time in the garden that week, finding that physical work was the only reliable way to keep my hands from trembling. When I heard Dennis's voice through the kitchen window rise in a way it almost never did, a sudden, sharp elevation, the voice of a man who has just stepped on something unexpected in the dark. I stayed in the garden. I deadheaded the roses very slowly and listened. By the time he came outside, he had composed himself into something that was almost his normal face. Almost. There was a tightness around his jaw that I recognized from 31 years as the specific look of a man who is recalculating. Margaret. He almost never called me Margaret. "Dennis," I said and clipped a stem. "I need to talk to you about the house." "Which house?" I asked pleasantly. The recalculation behind his eyes went into overdrive. He had expected, I think, either tears or ignorance. He had not expected pleasantness. He had not considered, in whatever plan he had assembled with Kristen Daly, that the woman who had spent 37 years managing the emotional temperature of classrooms full of 9-year-olds might be somewhat more difficult to destabilize than he'd assumed. "Franklin Greer filed something," he said. "Did he?" I put down my clippers and looked at him directly, perhaps for the first time in months. "That must have been surprising for you." He stared at me for a long moment. Then he went back inside. That evening, Kristen Daly called my cell phone. I did not know she had my number. I found out later Dennis had given it to her, apparently because they had expected to need to negotiate. And hearing her voice, composed and almost sympathetic, was one of the more surreal experiences of that period. She said she wanted to explain. She said there had been a misunderstanding. She said that Dennis had told her the house was solely in his name, and she had no reason to believe otherwise. I let her finish. "Kristen," I said, "my attorney will be in touch with yours. Margaret, if this goes to court—" "Then it goes to court," I said, and ended the call. 2 days later, they came to the house together. I want to be precise about this moment because it revealed something important about both of them. They came together, which told me that individually they were afraid of what I might say or do, and that they needed the psychological reinforcement of each other. Dennis rang the bell as though he didn't have a key, which by that point he didn't, because I had changed the locks the morning after my second meeting with Franklin, a detail that clearly startled him when I opened the door and he instinctively reached for his pocket. Kristen was polished. She was calm, and she stood at a slight angle to Dennis in a way that positioned her as the rational party, in contrast to the potential chaos she expected from me. She was perhaps 44 or 45. She had the careful poise of a woman who has learned to manage difficult conversations professionally, and for a moment I understood why Dennis had found her compelling. She projected capability. "We'd like to come in," Dennis said. I considered this for exactly 2 seconds. Then I stepped aside. They sat at my kitchen table. I noticed Dennis's eyes move to the fireproof box's usual spot on the shelf, which was now empty. And Kristen spoke first. She had clearly prepared. The core of what she said was this: that pursuing legal action would be costly, prolonged, and damaging to everyone, including my daughter Claire, whose name she mentioned in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. She said that a private settlement could be arranged quickly. She implied, without stating directly, that my willingness to litigate would be portrayed as a vindictive older woman attempting to sabotage her husband's retirement finances. I looked at her while she talked. I looked at Dennis, who was not meeting my eyes. "Let me make sure I understand," I said when she finished. "You're suggesting that I accept a private payment, relinquish any legal claim to my father's house, and in exchange, you'll refrain from telling people I'm being vindictive." "I wouldn't put it that way." "I would," I said, "and my answer is no." Dennis finally looked at me. "Peggy, if this goes criminal, deed fraud is a felony, Dennis. It was a felony when you committed it." The temperature in the kitchen changed. Kristen's composure slipped for just a moment, a tightening around the eyes that she covered quickly. And Dennis went very still in the way that men go still when they realize they have significantly miscalculated the nature of the person they've been living with. They left 20 minutes later. No settlement, no agreement. Nothing resolved except the question of whether I could be pressured, which had been answered definitively. I closed the door and stood in my hallway for a moment. My heart was beating faster than I would have liked. I was 68 years old, and I had just told my husband of 31 years and his mistress in my own kitchen that I intended to bring a felony case against them, and the reality of what that meant. The months ahead, the courtroom, the public nature of it all, settled on me like a weight. I called my daughter Claire that evening, not the Sunday call, a real call. She arrived from Portland the following Friday. I took those 4 days for myself. I sat in the garden in the mornings. I read. I did not answer emails about the case. I let Franklin handle the correspondence, and I let myself be still for a short stretch before the real work began, because I had learned in 37 years of teaching that the people who last longest in a fight are not the ones who burn brightest at the start, but the ones who know when to rest. Claire arrived on a Friday evening with a bag large enough for 2 weeks and an expression I had last seen on her face when she was 9 years old, and had decided to personally hold accountable a boy in her class who had stolen her library book. My daughter is 43, a structural engineer, and she has my father's jaw and my mother's determination and very little patience for dishonesty in any of its forms. She sat at the kitchen table while I made tea, and I told her everything from the beginning. I told her about the garage phone calls, about Florida, about the file folder he'd moved, about the Cook family on the porch with keys cut from locks I hadn't changed, about Kristen Daly's phone call and the joint bank account bearing both their names, and the $1.5 million that had passed through it. I told her about the forged signature, reading her the relevant line from Dr. Voss's report from memory, the words "simulation" by a person other than the purported signer, falling into the kitchen with the particular weight of professional confirmation. Claire held her tea and did not speak until I had finished. Then she said, "Mom, where is he now?" "He checked into the Residence Inn on Burnside 3 days ago," I said. "I changed the locks." She nodded slowly. "Good. Then, what do you need from me?" That question. I had been holding myself together for 2 weeks, largely on forward motion, and the avoidance of stopping long enough to ask that question of myself. What did I need? I needed someone to sit across from me at this table who was not performing, who was not calculating, who was simply there. I had forgotten, in the strange sealed world of the previous 2 weeks, what it felt like to have someone simply be on your side without conditions. "I need you to stay for a while," I said. "Obviously," Claire said and refilled my tea. The following week was, in its way, the quietest of that entire period. Dennis and Kristen had retreated, not out of surrender, I understood, but out of strategy. They were consulting with their own attorney, a man named Howard Bloom, whose name Franklin mentioned with a very slight pause that conveyed a library of professional opinion. They were preparing their own narrative. I knew this. Franklin knew this, but the immediate noise had stopped, and in the quiet, I could hear myself think again. "I want to tell you about something that happened on the Wednesday of that week, because it mattered more than it might sound." My friend Doris Hartley, from the book club, the one whose house I'd been at the evening this all began, came by with a casserole. Doris is 71 and has lived 3 doors down from me for 22 years, and she is the kind of woman who processes information slowly and then acts on it with great solidity. She sat in my living room while Claire was out, and she said, "Peggy, I need you to know that everyone on this street knows what he did, and not one person is neutral." I hadn't expected that. I hadn't told anyone except Claire, Franklin, and my sister in Ohio. But Clover Hill was a neighborhood in the old sense. People noticed when a strange car was in a driveway, when a woman walked her garden with a tighter jaw than usual, when a man suddenly stopped being seen carrying in groceries on Saturday mornings. People talked. And in this case, they had talked in my favor. "They'll say things," Doris said. "In court or wherever, people who've seen him come and go. Neighbors who had appraisers walking through without anyone explaining why. I kept a note last spring when a man with a clipboard was photographing your house from the sidewalk. I didn't know what it meant then. A man with a clipboard photographing my house. That photograph would later appear in Dennis's records as part of the property appraisal documentation. Doris's note of the date placed it 6 weeks before the fraudulent deed transfer. I wrote down the date she gave me and called Franklin the next morning. Meanwhile, Dennis and Kristen apparently decided that patience was their best weapon. According to what Franklin heard through proper legal channels, their defense was taking shape around 2 arguments. First, that I had been aware of and had verbally consented to the sale as part of an informal marital agreement. And second, that the signature on the deed was not forged, but was the result of my signing a document I had been confused about. That second argument, confused elderly woman didn't understand what she was signing, was the one that made Claire's jaw go hard when I told her. "They're going to try to make you seem incompetent," she said. "I know," I said. "How do you want to handle it?" I thought about that for a moment. I thought about 37 years of maintaining a classroom. I thought about the 10 minutes of fear I had given myself at the kitchen table and then never returned to. I thought about Dr. Voss's 19-page report and the date Doris had written in her notebook. "Calmly," I said, "there is a kind of power that becomes available to you when you stop being afraid of someone's narrative about you." Dennis had constructed a version of me, confused, passive, aging, easily managed, that had apparently been convincing enough for him to bet a $1.5 million fraud on. That version of me had made him comfortable. It had made him careless. And carelessness, in matters of law, leaves traces. The traces were accumulating. I spent those quiet days organizing them. Franklin and I spoke every other day. I submitted a formal affidavit attesting that I had never verbally or otherwise consented to any sale of the property and had no knowledge of any such proceeding until September. Dr. Voss finalized her report, 23 pages in its final form, and was confirmed as the expert witness for the hearing. Claire, who turned out to have a highly specific competence in reading structural and property documents from her engineering work, reviewed everything in the case file and found 2 additional inconsistencies in the closing paperwork that Franklin's team then followed up on. Through all of it, Dennis and Kristen watched. I could feel it. The occasional unknown number calling and hanging up when I answered. The white sedan that parked on our street for 2 hours one afternoon. Watching to see if I would wobble. Watching to see if the casseroles and the quiet days and the accumulated weight of 31 years would eventually soften my position. I did not wobble. I planted tulip bulbs on Saturday and thought about spring. They came on a Sunday, which was, I thought, deliberately chosen. Sunday was the day I called Claire, before she moved in, the day of roast dinners and deliberate normalcy. I think Dennis believed that the day itself carried some residual power over me, some Pavlovian pull toward civility and the maintenance of the household peace. He rang the bell at 2 in the afternoon. He was alone this time. No Kristen. I let him in because refusing would have been, legally speaking, complicated. We were still technically married, the divorce filing having been initiated but not yet finalized. And because I was, honestly, curious about what approach he had decided on. The visits that are most revealing are the ones where someone believes they are being clever. He sat in the living room, not the kitchen, which was a deliberate choice. The living room was more formal, less intimate. The room we had used for guests. He had dressed carefully. The blue sweater I had given him 2 Christmases ago, which I recognized as a calculated choice. He looked tired and, I will give him this, somewhat diminished from the man who had stood in my garden 2 weeks earlier with a recalculating expression. Howard Bloom had apparently been honest with him about the strength of the case against them. He started with the past. This is a technique I had seen in parents at teacher conferences more times than I could count. When the direct argument is failing, you go to the emotional history. You invoke the shared investment. You remind the other party of what they stand to lose by continuing to fight. Dennis talked about our first house together, a rental in Gresham back in 1989. He talked about Claire's childhood. He talked about his own father's failing health, which was real, and which I did have sympathy for. He talked about how the stress of the case was affecting him. I listened. I kept my hands in my lap. I did not say anything that could be construed as softening. And then, when the sentimentality had failed to produce the response he needed, the second layer emerged. Peggy. He leaned forward. Howard has found something. In your mother's estate filing. There's an argument to be made that the transfer of the property to you personally, rather than to both of us jointly, was contestable, based on intent. I looked at him. Your parents' will didn't specify you alone. Howard believes that with the marriage already established at the time of the estate. My parents left the house to me, I said, by name, in a will that was probated in Washington County in 2007 with Franklin Greer as the estate attorney. The document is not ambiguous. Dennis shifted. Howard thinks, I would be careful, I said, about what Howard thinks he can do with my parents' estate. The sentimentality was gone now. In its place was something I had not seen very often in 31 years of marriage, a direct display of what I can only call contempt. Not the contempt of someone who hates you, but the particular contempt of someone who has decided you are an obstacle they intend to dismantle. You're 68 years old, Peggy, he said. This case will take 2 years. The legal fees alone, Franklin charges $400 an hour. Do you understand what this will cost you? Do you understand what forging my signature will cost you? I said. Silence. This isn't a game, he said, and his voice had dropped in a way I had not heard before, a lowering of register that was intended, I think, to signal a kind of seriousness that hadn't been present in earlier conversations. Howard is prepared to argue that you have shown signs of cognitive decline, that your testimony is supported, I said, by a forensic document examiner with 17 expert witness cases, a signed affidavit, property records dating back to 1961, and a neighbor's dated written record of unauthorized appraisal activity on my property. What is Howard's testimony supported by? Dennis stood up. At this point, Kristen's voice came from the front hallway. She had been in the car, I realized. She had been waiting in the car during the soft first act, and now she walked in without knocking. I had not fully closed the front door, a mistake I noted and did not repeat. And she stood in my living room with the composure of someone who has made a decision and is past caring how it lands. "Mrs. Harlow," she said, "I want to be direct with you. We have enough to tie this up in litigation for 3 years. The Cooks are considering their own civil suit against you for the delayed transfer. Your attorney's fees will exceed anything you receive in a settlement. The smart thing, the practical thing, is to take what we're offering, which is fair, and move on." "What you're offering," I said, "is the proceeds of a fraudulent sale, reduced by your legal fees, in exchange for my silence about a felony." I looked at her with great steadiness. "That's not a settlement. That's hush money." The mask, the professional composure, the careful positioning, came off in a way that was almost a relief to witness. Her voice went tight. "You're making a mistake." "I've made mistakes," I said. "Trusting your partner for 31 years was one of them. I don't intend to make another." Dennis said her name. She ignored him. "You're going to spend everything you have fighting this," she said. "And you're going to lose, and you're going to be alone in this house." "If I still have this house," I said, "I'll be quite content." They left. I closed the door and turned the deadbolt, my deadbolt, on my lock, and leaned against it for just a moment. My hands, I noticed, were trembling slightly, not from fear precisely, though fear was present. It was more the physical release of adrenaline after an hour of very controlled stillness, my body catching up to what my mind had been doing. I made a cup of tea. I sat down. I allowed the trembling to pass, and then I noticed something interesting. The fear, rather than expanding in the quiet, was transforming. It was converting, as it had once before at this table, into something colder and harder and considerably more durable. Every threat they had made, the cognitive decline argument, the litigation costs, the Cook civil suit, had been, from a legal standpoint, noise. Howard Blum was a good attorney, but he was working with a forged document, a fraudulent account, and a client whose guilt was documented in 19, now 23, pages of forensic analysis. They were threatening me because they were afraid. That realization settled into my chest like ballast. I called Franklin on Monday morning and told him exactly what had been said, including the cognitive decline strategy. "Good," Franklin said with the same dry directness he always had. "That will not help them in front of the judge." The hearing was set for 6 weeks from Thursday. I went back to the garden. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. What we had was a civil courtroom on the 3rd floor of the Multnomah County Courthouse. Plain fluorescent light, wood-paneled walls gone pale with age, and approximately 14 people present, including the attorneys, the clerk, the judge, and the Cook family, who sat on the opposite side of the gallery with their own attorney and the expression of people who have spent 6 months in a nightmare they didn't ask for. I wore my gray dress with the pearl buttons. Claire sat in the gallery 2 rows behind me. Doris Hartley had offered to come, and I had told her to stay home. But when I walked in, I saw her in the back row in her good coat, which made me grip my folder more tightly for a moment to keep my composure. Dennis and Kristen sat at the respondents' table with Howard Blum between them. Howard was a trim man in his late 50s with a very controlled face. The face of someone who has learned to project confidence regardless of what the underlying circumstances warrant. Kristen was in navy blue. Dennis was in the gray suit he'd worn to both of our children's college graduations. Franklin presented first. The forensic document analysis, the county recorder's timeline. The bank account opened in Kristen's and Dennis's names 6 months before the transfer, into which the sale proceeds had been directly deposited. A property appraiser who confirmed that Dennis had contacted him in March of the previous year, 7 months before the fraudulent deed transfer, requesting a private appraisal and specifically instructing him not to contact the homeowner. That last one landed. I saw Howard Blum write something quickly on his notepad. Then Doris testified. She sat in the witness chair with her hands folded in her lap, and the particular dignity of a 71-year-old woman who has decided to tell the truth and is not interested in anyone's opinion about it. She gave the date, the time, and a description of the man with the clipboard, a description that matched the appraiser who had just testified. She produced her written note, dated in her own hand, admitted as Exhibit 12. Howard's cross-examination of Doris was brief. There wasn't much to work with. Then it was my turn. Franklin walked me through everything. The inheritance, the original deed, the fireproof box, my certainty that I had never signed any transfer document, never been consulted about any sale, never given consent of any kind. He asked me to look at the signature on the deed transfer and tell the court whether it was mine. "It is not," I said. "How certain are you?" "Completely certain. I have signed my name the same way for 50 years. That is not my signature." Howard Blum's cross-examination circled the cognitive decline argument without fully committing to it, implying confusion, questioning my certainty, suggesting that stress had perhaps affected my memory. He was good at it. But here is the thing about 37 years in a classroom. You know exactly when someone is performing certainty versus when they actually have it. Howard was performing. He had no positive facts to establish, only doubt to introduce. I answered every question directly, calmly, and completely. When he asked whether I might have signed something I didn't fully read, I said, "I am a former teacher, Mr. Blum. I have read every document I have signed for 40 years. That is not a habit I developed recently." Someone in the gallery made a small sound. The judge did not look up. Howard called Dennis. Under Franklin's cross-examination, Dennis was asked to provide the date of his claimed verbal conversation with me about the sale. He gave a month, April. Franklin produced our joint bank records from April showing nothing consistent with a real estate discussion, and the plane tickets and hotel receipts from our Florida trip that same month, during which Dennis had previously stated in a deposition we had discussed the future of the property over dinner. "What restaurant?" Franklin asked. Dennis looked at Howard. Howard did not look back. "I don't remember the name," Dennis said. "What did you order?" I don't remember." "Mr. Harlow, can you describe anything specific about this dinner at which you claim your wife verbally consented to the sale of her inherited property?" The silence lasted long enough to be recorded. Kristen held up better than Dennis under questioning. She was more capable under pressure. But her account contained 3 specific inconsistencies with Dennis's that Howard had apparently failed to reconcile during preparation. Franklin identified all 3 and laid them on the record one after another with systematic precision. By the time Judge Carla Reyes called the afternoon recess, Dennis was leaning close to Howard in urgent, quiet conversation, and Kristen was staring at the table with the fixed expression of someone who has processed but not yet fully accepted that a situation has gone irreversibly wrong. Claire found me in the hallway near the window. "You okay?" she said. "Yes," I said. "I think we're okay." Judge Reyes issued her ruling 18 days after the hearing. Franklin called me on a Tuesday morning. I was in the garden, and I sat down on the bench under the oak tree to take the call. The ruling was 31 pages. The deed transfer was declared void ab initio, from the beginning, as though it had never occurred. The fraudulent nature of the signature was confirmed, adopting Dr. Voss's expert findings in full. The sale to the Cook family was invalidated, with the court ordering that the proceeds held in escrow be distributed accordingly. A full refund to the Cooks, with additional damages for their relocation costs and distress, to be paid by Dennis Harlow and Kristen Daly jointly. The property was mine, title restored to Margaret Ann Harlow, sole owner, as it had been since 2007. "There's one more thing," Franklin said. The district attorney's office had been monitoring the civil proceedings. Based on the judge's findings, a criminal referral had been made. The DA was proceeding with charges: deed fraud, forgery of a legal document, and financial fraud, the last carrying a maximum sentence of 5 years in Oregon. "What about Kristen?" "Named as co-conspirator. Her exposure is significant." I sat under the oak tree for a long time after the call ended. The tree had shed most of its leaves, and the light came through the branches in the particular way it does in November, thin and clear and very still. I had lived under this tree my entire life. No one was going to take it. The divorce was finalized 6 weeks later. Dennis's leverage was gone. His ability to threaten or obstruct had collapsed in a Multnomah County courtroom, and what remained was paperwork. He received the contents of our joint savings account, his retirement funds, and the furniture he had removed to the residence inn. He received nothing from the house, nothing from my parents' estate. I did not attend the finalization. Franklin represented my interests. I was in my garden. The Cook family was made entirely whole by the court. Melissa sent me a note through Franklin's office saying she was sorry and hoped I was well. I wrote back the same. They had been used, as I had been, and their culpability was zero. Dennis's criminal case concluded the following year. He pleaded guilty to deed fraud and forgery. The financial fraud charge was reduced as part of the plea. He was sentenced to 18 months supervised probation, a substantial fine, community service, and a permanent record that precluded any future work in financial services or real estate. Kristen accepted a plea on the financial fraud conspiracy charge. She paid restitution, lost her position at the insurance firm, and received probation. I will be honest. I did not feel triumphant. What I felt, standing in my house on the day the divorce was finalized, was something quieter and more durable, something closer to the feeling you have when a window has been properly shut and the house is warm again after a long, cold draft. I changed the art in the hallway. I got rid of the kitchen table, not out of anger, but because I wanted a table that held only its own history, and bought a new one, round, from a woman in Lake Oswego who made furniture from reclaimed wood. Claire helped me carry in the chairs. Franklin sent a bottle of wine. Doris brought a casserole. The oak tree was bare, and the garden was put to bed for winter, and the house was mine, in a way it had always legally been, and now simply was in every other sense, too. The spring after the divorce, I planted the largest garden I had ever planted in my life. 40 tulip bulbs along the front walk, put in during October at the height of everything, came up in April as though they had been waiting patiently for the right moment. A kitchen garden along the south fence, tomatoes, basil, runner beans, the small Persian cucumbers Claire has loved since she was a child. I put in a climbing rose along the back wall, pale yellow. the kind my mother had grown before she and my father moved to Clover Hill. I had never grown one before. I figured it was time. Claire took a position with an engineering firm downtown that spring and found an apartment 15 minutes away. Thursday dinners, Sunday farmers markets. It was the most time we had spent in the same city since she left for college in 1999. I rejoined the book club. I started a history reading group at the library that within a year had 14 members. I found that I had opinions about a great many things I had been keeping pleasantly to myself for years. In October, Doris and I took 2 weeks through the Cotswolds and up into Yorkshire. We laughed more in those 2 weeks than I had laughed in the preceding several years combined. We booked the same trip for the following spring. I found, quite good at being alone. The house held differently with just me in it, not emptily, but with clarity. I sat in the evenings with books and tea and felt consistently, entirely at ease. Dennis was living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Gresham, where we had rented together in 1989. His record made the insurance career untenable. I hope he was present for his father's decline, because that part deserved kindness. Kristen Daly left Portland. I did not wish her ill. I wished her simply elsewhere, which is where she was. In September, I enrolled in a watercolor class. No particular talent, but considerable patience. The more useful quality, it turns out. By December, I had painted 6 small pictures. The best one was the oak tree in November, bare against a gray sky. I framed it and hung it where Dennis's golf photos had been. If there is one lesson in all of this, it is simple. The people who believe you are not paying attention are always making a very large bet on a very thin assumption. Know your own name on your own documents. Know what you own. Do not confuse kindness with inattention. If you ever find strangers on your porch holding keys to your home, smile, let them in, and call your attorney. What would you have done? I would genuinely like to know. Leave a comment. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for listening.